Imagine for a moment that everything you have ever been taught about the beginning of human civilization is wrong. Imagine that the true story of humanity did not start in Sumer, or in Egypt, or in any of the ancient empires we admire today, but in a time so old, so distant, so hidden beneath layers of forgotten earth that even our deepest myths could barely remember it. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the darkness settles gently around you, let your mind step beyond the boundaries of recorded history. Let the noise fade. Let the night open a door to a world that existed long before memory, long before writing, long before the first kings carved their names into stone. Welcome to Dreams of History. Here, in this calm nighttime story, we do not follow the timelines written in textbooks. We follow the shadow's faint traces of a chapter erased from human memory. A chapter that may have begun not 6,000 years ago, not 10,000, but 200,000 years before Sumer, a time when the world was young, the skies unfamiliar, the continents shaped differently, and yet perhaps civilization had already taken root. A civilization older than the pyramids, older than the flood legends, older than the last ice age. A civilization that rose, flourished, and vanished long before the first known kingdom appeared. As you listen, allow the darkness to guide you gently into this forgotten world. Picture vast landscapes untouched by modern hands, oceans that glowed beneath unfamiliar constellations, valleys where ancient people might have looked up at the same moon we see today, wondering, dreaming, building. Picture minds capable of understanding the patterns of the stars, of shaping stone with techniques we still cannot explain, of surviving in a world far more dangerous and wild than ours. Picture a people who may have known secrets later echoed in Sumerian myths, Egyptian legends, African oral traditions, and the oldest stories humanity still whispers in the dark. What if those stories, the ones dismissed as fantasy, are fragments of a memory far older than we ever imagined? What if the first civilization was not Sumer, but merely the last civilization after a long line of forgotten worlds? What if everything we know is just the surviving page of a book whose earlier chapters were burned by time itself? Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the quiet deepens, we step into that erased chapter. We trace the faint footprints left beneath ice, beneath ocean floors, beneath mountains that have risen and fallen. We follow clues scattered across continents like pieces of a puzzle, waiting for someone to see the full picture. Was there truly a civilization 200,000 years before Sumer? If so, who were they? What did they know? How did they live? And why did they disappear so completely, leaving behind only whispers? Let the night carry you into that mystery. Let the forgotten world unfold slowly, quietly, one ancient breath at a time. For tonight, we remember what history forgot. Imagine the world as it was then, 200,000 years before the first cities, before the first temples, before a single line of cuneiform was pressed into wet clay. The earth breathed differently in that age. Great plains stretched across continents that no longer exist in the same form. Forests rose like living walls, thicker and darker than any surviving jungle. Rivers carved paths through valleys that would one day be buried beneath oceans. The air was colder in places, warmer in others, but everywhere the world felt vast, untamed, and ancient in a way we can hardly understand now. Yet in this raw, primordial world, something unusual stirred. Not just survival, not just instinct, not just the simple life of early humans. There are signs, faint but undeniable, that something more existed. Something organized. Something intelligent. Something capable of shaping its world. Archaeologists speak of bones found in African-anatomically modern humans far older than Sumer. Older than Egypt, older even than the first known settlements. Bones with proportions like ours, hands like ours, skulls shaped for thoughts far deeper than basic survival. These early humans did not simply wander. They observed, learned, adapted, evolved. They carried within them a spark that would one day build cities, write scriptures, and map the stars. But what if that spark ignited far earlier than we think? Imagine them standing on high cliffs, overlooking valleys drenched in golden sunlight. Imagine them carving patterns into stone, not crude marks of early survival, but meaningful symbols, stories, warnings. Imagine them gathering around firelight, not just for warmth, but to share knowledge, the rise and fall of stars, the rhythms of seasons, the migrations of animals, the signs of the land. Knowledge so old that it became myth, passed from one generation to the next until it reached cultures that never knew its origin. And imagine this knowledge traveling across ages like a quiet river, changing, fading, reshaping until it finally appeared thousands of years later in the writings of Sumer, in the glyphs of Egypt, in the myths of Greece, in the legends of India, in the oral traditions of Africa. What if all these stories are merely echoes of something far older, something born in a world we no longer remember? As the night deepens around you, picture this early world in your mind. A world lit by fire and starlight. A world where the first hints of civilization flickered like distant embers. A world where people looked at the same constellations we see tonight and tried to understand their meaning. A world where curiosity was already alive, where questions were already forming, where dreams of something greater had already begun, if such a civilization existed. Even in fragments, its traces would be faint, buried under ice ages, swallowed by rising seas, shattered by earthquakes, consumed by time. But time, despite its power, cannot erase everything. Here and there, scattered across continents, we find anomalies, artifacts that do not fit the known timeline, tools too advanced for their age, carvings older than they should be, structures whose precision defies explanation, stories that tell of worlds wiped clean, of cycles of destruction and rebirth, of ages before the ages we know. And beneath all of it lies a quiet question, like a heartbeat in the dark. How much have we forgotten? Perhaps far more than we imagine. Perhaps enough to rewrite the entire story of humanity. Perhaps enough to make us realize that Sumer was not the beginning, but merely the latest beginning. Tonight, as you drift deeper into this forgotten world, let the images of that lost civilization grow clearer. Picture their hands carving symbols into stone, their eyes reflecting firelight, their minds searching for meaning in the stars. Picture their world rising, and one day, falling. Not because they failed, but because the earth itself shifted beneath them, as it has so many times throughout history. Tonight, we walk beside them. Tonight, we remember them. Tonight, the story continues. Picture the quiet moments of that ancient world, the soft glow of early dawn spreading across untouched valleys, the slow movement of shadows slipping over stones carved by hands long vanished, the gentle hum of wind passing through forests that would one day become deserts, plains, and oceans. In this silence, in this raw stillness, it becomes easier to imagine that humanity's story stretches much farther back than we have ever allowed ourselves to believe. Because if 200,000 years ago, people walked the earth with minds capable of reflection, creativity, and connection, then the possibility of a lost civilization becomes not just a theory, but a whisper of truth carried through time. Imagine standing among them, not as an outsider from the future, but as a silent observer drifting through a world untouched by cities or machines, yet alive with intelligence. You might see groups of people gathered along riverbanks, shaping stones with surprising precision, tools that look almost too refined for the age. You might see them building with purpose walls of stacked stone, aligned with sunrise and moonrise, structures designed to hold meaning long after they vanish. You might see early attempts at counting, measuring, carving symbols into wood bone, clay symbols that might one day evolve into writing, then into myth, then into the stories that reached civilizations we recognize. And perhaps the most fascinating question is this: how much of what we see in Sumer, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in the Maya, was not invention, but inheritance? Inheritance from a world forgotten. Think of Göbekli Tepe, a place archaeologists now admit is older than any known civilization. 11,000, 12,000, maybe more. Columns weighing tons, carved with animals and symbols, arranged with astronomical precision. Too advanced, too sudden, too complete to be the work of beginners. It appears not as the dawn of civilization, but as the echo of something older knowledge passed down from a people who had lived, learned, and perhaps fallen long before. If such knowledge survived for 12,000 years, why not 200,000? Picture a small community living near a great inland lake, now long vanished, watching patterns in the stars as they change through the seasons. Picture them mapping the movement of constellations, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the approach of comets that would return only after thousands of years. Modern science calls this impossible. Yet ancient myths speak of people who knew the sky before the sky changed. How could they know unless someone before them had witnessed those cycles? This is where the story begins to deepen, because geology tells us the Earth has experienced countless cataclysms over hundreds of thousands of years. Massive volcanic eruptions shifting tectonic plates, sudden floods triggered by melting ice sheets, extinction-level meteor impacts. Any one of these could wipe out a civilization so completely that only whispers remain. And over 200,000 years, such events happened not once, but many times. Imagine a culture thriving for tens of thousands of years, then disappearing overnight. Their cities washed away, their knowledge scattered, their stories reduced to fragments told by survivors who barely understood what had been lost. Those survivors pass their memories to their children and they to theirs, until the stories turn into myth. Stories of a golden age, stories of a great flood, stories of a sky that once burned bright, stories of ancestors who walked with knowledge of the heavens, stories repeated by cultures all around the world, from Sumer to India, from the Hopi to the Dogon, from Australia to the Andes-Sevri. Ancient tradition speaks of a time before time, a time of great beings, wise ancestors, advanced societies, and sudden destruction. Could all these stories be coincidence? Or are they memories distorted by distance, softened by centuries, but rooted in something real? As you listen in the quiet of this night, imagine those memories drifting like smoke across the ages. Imagine them carried by travelers, hunters, families, people trying to preserve fragments of what came before. They did not know that their world would be forgotten. They did not know that future civilizations would rise and claim the title of first. They only knew that something magnificent had been lost. And in their loss, in their stories, in their symbols etched into rock, they left clues for anyone patient enough to look beneath the surface of time. Tonight, we follow those clues deeper into caves, into forgotten coastlines, into the bones of early humans who lived and died long before the world we know began. Each step takes us further from familiar history and closer to the possibility of a civilization erased by time, but not by truth. Asterisk, asterisk. As we move deeper into this forgotten age, imagine walking through a landscape where the familiar rules of history no longer apply. There are no ruins we can easily date, no inscriptions we can confidently translate, no monuments declaring who ruled and who followed. Instead, there are shapes in stone worn down by unimaginable time, faint carvings half raised by the winds of ages, and artifacts buried so deeply that their discovery feels like uncovering a dream rather than a fact. In such a world, every clue becomes precious, and every silence becomes meaningful. Picture a vast plain, stretching out beneath a sky untouched by pollution or modern lights. The stars above shine brighter, sharper, clearer than anything we see today. In this ancient darkness, early humans might have seen patterns we no longer notice, rhythms in the heavens we no longer understand. They might have watched the slow drift of stars across millennia, learned the pulse of the seasons not just by instinct, but through careful observation, passing this knowledge to their children who passed it to theirs. Over tens of thousands of years, such observations could become a form of science primitive by our standards, but profound in its accuracy. Now imagine them turning this knowledge into structures. Not random piles of stones, but deliberate constructions aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and celestial events. Stone circles marking the movements of the sun, pillars pointing to rising stars, pathways laid out along magnetic lines of the earth. If these structures existed, then some evidence suggests they would have been swallowed by time, buried by shifting sands, drowned by rising oceans, shattered by earthquakes, eroded by ice. And yet, here and there, fragments remain. Think of the submerged ruins found off the coast of India, Japan, and the Caribbean structures that appear artificially shaped, but are so old they predate the last ice age. Think of the caves in southern Africa with markings that look like maps of the night sky 40,000 years old, maybe more. Think of the tools in East Africa that suggest precision, planning, and advanced craftsmanship long before history acknowledges such skills. None of these discoveries prove a lost civilization existed, but taken together, they whisper, softly but persistently, that the world before Sumer was not as empty as we once imagined. As night fully settles around you, imagine descending into a cave illuminated only by the faint flicker of torchlight. On its walls, you see shapes not random, not chaotic, but patterned. Lines carved with purpose, spirals that match astronomical cycles, figures that seem to represent constellations long before they were officially named. Imagine the hands that carved them steady, practiced, intelligent. Imagine the message they tried to preserve, knowing it might outlive them. Knowing that one day someone might return to these walls and try to understand in another part of the world. Imagine an early settlement near a great river that no longer exists. Here, people gather stones in circular patterns, carving symbols into them that resemble early writing. Not full sentences, not language as we know it, but the beginnings of a system, a way to pass information across generations. Patterns of lines, dots, shapes. Perhaps these symbols once told stories of the stars, or the migrations of animals, or the coming of storms. Perhaps they told of a disaster that changed everything, because every ancient culture speaks of such a disaster. A great flood that rose suddenly and without mercy. A fire from the sky that scorched the earth. A darkness that lasted for days. A cold that settled over the land. A shaking of the ground that swallowed cities whole. A world that ended, and then began again. The Sumerians spoke of it. The Egyptians wrote of it. The Greeks preserved it in myth. The Indians recorded it in their epics. The Maya carved it into stone. The Aboriginal Australians remembered it in song. The African tribes carried it through oral history. The Hebrews preserved it in scripture. How could all these cultures, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, describe the same event unless they were all remembering fragments of something older? Something experienced by ancestors long before Sumer. As you drift further into this night story, imagine that disaster not as a single event, but as one of many cycles the Earth has undergone. Cataclysms that rise and fall like breath, reshaping continents, rewriting coastlines, wiping away entire civilizations. If a society existed 200,000 years ago, it would have faced these cycles again and again. Some events might have struck without warning a city's knowledge and progress in a matter of days. Others might have given time to prepare, allowing fragments of their wisdom to pass down through survivors. And so we ask again, if such a civilization lived and died before Sumer, where are the ruins? Where are the cities? Where is the proof? The truth is simple. 200,000 years is enough time for everything to vanish. Stone decays, wood rots, metal corrodes, fire consumes, water washes away, ice grinds mountains into dust. Ocean waves break any structure, no matter how mighty. And after enough cycles, even memory fades into silence, but not completely. There are always fragments, small, stubborn pieces of a world that refuses to be forgotten. Tools buried in layers too old, caves with markings too deliberate, submerged structures too precise, myths too consistent, genes too unusual, questions too loud to ignore tonight. We follow these fragments deeper into the forgotten world toward the people who lived before memory, before history, before Sumer. Their story is quiet, but it is not gone. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Imagine now that you are walking across a coastline that no longer exists on any modern map. The waves wash gently against the rocks, but the land beneath your feet is ancient, older than any ruin, older than any legend, older even than the oldest names ever carved by human hands. The air carries a scent of salt and wind, but beneath it there is something else. A feeling, a presence, as if the ground remembers footsteps that walked here long before time began to record anything. You pause, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the ocean. And for a moment, it feels as if the earth itself is whispering a story, one that has waited a very, very long time to be heard again. Long before Sumer, long before Egypt rose from desert sands, long before the first clay tablet was pressed with the earliest symbols of writing, people lived along coastlines that are now buried under hundreds of feet of water. The last ice age locked vast amounts of water into immense glaciers, lowering sea levels around the world. Cities, settlements, gathering places, whatever the people of that time built would have been placed along these coastlines, close to food, water, and trade routes. And when the ice melted, slowly at first, and then with incredible force, those coastlines vanished under rising oceans. Imagine an entire world disappearing beneath the waves, not over centuries, but over days and weeks. A wall of water sweeping across valleys, drowning forests, swallowing everything in its path. Imagine families running, climbing to higher ground, carrying with them what memories they could. Imagine legends born in terror, stories of gods angry with humankind, stories of floods sent to cleanse the earth, stories of a world destroyed so completely that only fragments survived. These legends would be passed down through the generations, traveling across continents, reshaped by time, but never forgotten. The Sumerians called it the deluge. The Hebrews called it the flood. The Greeks remembered it as the story of Deucalion. The Indians recorded it in the tale of Manu. The Maya told of floods that came after great fires. The Chinese preserved the legend of King Yu. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia sang of rising waters that swallowed their ancestral lands. And as you stand on that ancient coastline in your imagination, you begin to realize that these stories are not mythology, they are memory. Memory of a world ending. Memory of something older than any civilization we know. Memory of a time when the people who lived before Sumer watched their entire existence disappear beneath a force of nature so immense that it erased nearly every trace of them, but not everything was lost. Imagine survivors moving inland, small groups scattered across continents, carrying only what they could remember. Stories, knowledge, warnings, perhaps even tools or symbols passed down through families, treasured not because they understood them, but because they knew they came from a world that no longer existed. Over thousands of years, these remnants would become sacred lore. They would become rituals, oral traditions, fragments of myths. They would be the seeds that would one day grow into the great civilizations of the ancient world. Picture one such group settling in a valley surrounded by mountains. They build simple shelters at first, but they remember something: a shape, a pattern, a way of arranging stones. And slowly, instinctively, they rebuild what they once knew, though imperfectly. They align structures with the stars because their ancestors once did. They carve symbols into stone because their ancestors once wrote in ways now forgotten. They build temples, monuments, circles of stone, and by doing so, they unknowingly preserve echoes of a civilization lost in the deep past. Now imagine another group moving toward the rivers of Mesopotamia. Their knowledge is fragmented, but their memories guide them. They plant crops, build homes, and create the first symbols of writing, not from invention, but from recollection. Centuries later, these descendants would call themselves Sumerians. They would write stories of gods who came before, gods who built cities before the flood, gods who taught them knowledge they themselves could not fully understand. But what if these gods were not gods at all? What if they were the memory of ancestors humans from an earlier age, from a civilization buried by water and forgotten by time? As the night deepens, think of how fragile memory can be. Think of how Isley's entire lifetimes vanish, even today's stories lost when one generation fails to pass them to the next. Now stretch that fragility across hundreds of thousands of years. Imagine how many worlds could rise and fall in such an expanse of time. Imagine how many stories could disappear. Imagine how few clues would remain. Yet here and there, we still find traces. A tool to advance for its age. A cave painting that depicts something no simple hunter-gatherer should have been able to understand. A stone structure older than agriculture, aligned with stars that would shift positions over thousands of years. These are not accidents. These are not coincidences. These are the fingerprints of something older, something wiser, something forgotten. And as you listen in the quiet darkness of this night, you begin to feel that the question is no longer whether a civilization existed before Sumer, but how much of it survived, scattered across time like embers of a fire, waiting for someone to breathe them back into life. Asterisk, asterisk. Imagine now moving inland from those lost coastlines, following the survivors of that ancient flood as they wandered through landscapes reshaped by disaster. The world they once knew was gun-swallowed by water, torn apart by shifting earth, transformed into something unfamiliar. Forests they once walked through were buried under mud and silt. Mountains they once saw from afar were now islands or vanished beneath the sea. Rivers changed course. Lakes expanded or dried up. And with each passing generation, the memory of their old world became softer, dimmer, more dreamlike. But some memories survived. Not in libraries or temples, they had none left, but in stories whispered at night around flickering fires. Stories told by parents to children and by those children to theirs, until the story became a part of who they were. Stories of a time when their ancestors lived in great settlements, when they knew the ways of stone and star, when they understood secrets that were now only fragments scattered in their minds. These fragments would outlast cities, outlast floods, outlast time itself. They would shape the myths of every civilization that would rise long after. Think of those early survivors reaching high-ground mountain plateaus, hidden valleys, sheltered caves. In these places where life was still possible, they rebuilt what they could. Not grand structures, not cities of stone, not the complexity of their lost past, but the foundations of knowledge. They remembered how to create fire, how to shape simple tools, how to hunt, how to gather food, how to survive the cold, the heat, the seasons. And slowly, over centuries, they began to grow again. Small groups formed tribes. Tribes formed communities. Communities formed cultures. But deep in their collective memory was the echo of Clange Stare. My only lipstick, Rube Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture. That may squass my lift. As its same log, law last tick, long last de las, demuse. My lie last callas, communities, form. May you conly scrav, may you see to side my class, may you see us be live. May see to we con to CC, comida con sabat by I not see with. It's I can ness it. I not en my knee be a I likes cuff I not to me essa at. It's secret use ads lads it's a kid bit I sit to the it's to that something greater. Imagine a child asking an elder, "Where did we come from before the flood?" And the elder answering not with certainty, but with fragments. Our ancestors lived in a great place. A place now gone. A place the water took. These fragments would eventually become the stories we today call myth-stales of golden ages. Advanced beings, shining cities, gods descending from the heavens. Knowledge given to humans by visitors from beyond. But what if these visitors were simply the memory of a people who once lived in an age so distant and so different that their descendants could barely comprehend it? As the generations passed, small bands of people began to move again. Some traveled east, into the fertile lands that would one day become India and China. Others moved west, toward Africa and Europe. Some followed the great rivers north and south. And as they moved, they carried with them the last sparks of the civilization they had lost. Those sparks would one day ignite new civilizations, each rising with the faint memory of something older guiding their first steps. Now, imagine one group of survivors entering a fertile valley between two rivers, a place rich with water, soil, and promise. They begin to settle, to plant, to shape clay, to build. They carve symbols into wet earth, not because they are inventing writing for the first time, but because they are trying to remember what writing once was. Over centuries, those symbols grow more complex, more structured, until they become the earliest forms of cuneiform. This is the birth of Sumer, but it is not the beginning of human knowledge, only the rebirth in their stories. The Sumerians speak of a time before kingship descended from heaven, a time before civilization, before order, before the first cities. They list rulers who lived for thousands of years, ages so vast that mainstream history dismisses them as myth. But what if those long reigns were not literal years? What if they were memories of ages eras of a forgotten past compressed into the only language the survivors had left? Imagine another group moving into the Nile Valley. They remember the flood so vividly that the idea of a rising river becomes sacred. They watch the stars align their temples with Orion. Sirius, the solstices, the equinoxes not, because they are discovering astronomy, but because their ancestors once knew the stars far more deeply than they now remember. And so, Egyptian civilization rises not as an invention, but as a reconstruction, a rebuilding of knowledge from fragments passed through countless generations. Further east, in the Indus Valley, people build cities with advanced sewage systems, uniform brick sizes, urban planning far ahead of their time. How could they have created such order so quickly unless they carried the memory of older cities within them? And across the ocean, in the Americas, civilizations rise with astronomical knowledge so precise it defies explanation, cultures aligning structures with celestial cycles that take thousands of years to observe. How could they have known unless someone before them had watched the sky for ages upon ages? As you drift deeper into this night's story, imagine these civilizations not as isolated miracles, but as echoes, distant reflections of a civilization that lived and died long before Sumer, a civilization erased by time, remembered only in myth, in stone, in silence. And yet, hints remain. Tools found in Africa tens of thousands of years older than expected. Bones showing advanced development in early humans. Footprints preserved in volcanic ash that suggest behaviors far more complex than simple survival. Structures submerged beneath water older than any known culture. Myths of golden ages, lost continents, forgotten people repeated across the world. These are not coincidences. They are the last whispers of a world that once existed. A world we are only now beginning to rediscover. As the story drifts onward, imagine those early wanderers' descendants of a world. Erased, moving through forests so ancient that even the trees carried memories older than Sumer. The nights were darker then. Deeper, unbroken by any city lights. Above them, the sky stretched like a vast, endless ocean, filled with stars brighter than anything we can see today. And perhaps, beneath that sky, they began to remember. Not clearly, not perfectly, but enough to shape the foundations of the civilizations that would one day rise. Picture one such wandering group reaching a mountain cave for shelter. The cave is cool, silent, its walls untouched by human hands for tens of thousands of years. The survivors light a fire inside, and as the flames begin to dance, shadows move across the stone. A child watches these shadows flicker, and something awakens within him. A memory not his own, a faint echo of symbols carved by ancestors in a world long drowned. Without knowing why, he picks up a piece of charcoal and draws a circle, then lines around it. Then other shapes that feel familiar, instinctive. The others gather behind him, watching, remembering in their own way. These are the first steps of art, of record-keeping reborn from something that should have been lost forever. Over many generations, these symbols evolve. A spiral becomes a story. A series of dots becomes a star map. A pattern of carved lines becomes a marker of seasons. And soon, the cave becomes a library not of books, but of memory. Memory preserved on stone, waiting for someone thousands of years later to discover it and wonder how it came to be. Modern scholars call these markings primitive art, but perhaps they are not primitive at all. Perhaps they are the fragments of a forgotten science, a forgotten culture. A forgotten world trying to speak to us from the deep past. Now imagine traveling with another group, moving across what is now Africa. But what then was a land teeming with life? These people observe animal migrations, understand plant medicines, track weather patterns, to communicate in ways far more advanced than we once believed early humans could. They leave behind tools so precise that archaeologists today hesitate to date them. They carve symbols so complex that we still struggle to interpret them. In their knowledge of the land and sky, we see the faint outline of a civilization that once existed not in stone and metal, but in understanding, in observation, in memory, in the highlands of southern Africa. Ancient stone circles exist, thousands of them, lined with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Some researchers believe they may be over 100,000 years old. Mainstream history resists such claims. But the stones remain, silent and immovable, older than anyone can comfortably explain. What if these circles were once part of a vast network, a communication system, a calendar, or even a spiritual map created by the people who lived long before Sumer? What if these were temples of sound, of resonance, built by a civilization that understood the power of vibration and frequency in ways we no longer do? As the night deepens and your breathing slows, imagine these stone circles scattered across a world that no longer exists, markers of a civilization spread across continents, connected not by roads or writing, but by a shared understanding of the earth and sky. Imagine their knowledge flowing across generations like a quiet river, shaping the myths that would one day inspire the builders of pyramids, temples, and ziggurats. Knowledge that would resurface in unexpected places in the star alignments of Egypt, in the sacred geometry of Greece, in the astronomical precision of the Maya, in the myth cycles of India, in the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia, Now picture a moment thousands of years after the flood, when a small group of survivors reaches the plains of Mesopotamia. They settle near the rivers, plant crops, build homes from mud and straw. Their knowledge is shattered, incomplete, but still greater than what modern historians imagine possible for their time. They remember shapes, structures, star patterns, stories of cycles, tales of destruction and rebirth. They remember a time before the flood, a time when their ancestors lived in harmony with the cosmos. And so they begin to rebuild, not copying the past, but recreating it from fragments. In time, this small settlement grows into Sumer, the civilization we call the first. Though in truth, it may only be the first after a very long silence in their myths. The Sumerians speak of beings who taught them agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy. They call them gods, but the descriptions sound strangely human, tall beings with incredible knowledge. Those who came before, those who returned after the flood. Those who restored what was lost. Could these gods have been the last bearers of a forgotten civilization's knowledge, survivors who preserved what little they could and passed it forward? Imagine one old man among them, his hair white, his eyes deep with memories of stories told to him by his grandparents, who heard them from theirs. He sits by the fire at night, sharing tales of a world that once existed, a world of glowing cities, of star watchers, of lands now buried beneath water. The children listen with wide eyes. They do not know that they are hearing the last echoes of a civilization 200,000 years old. They only know that the stories feel ancient, powerful, true. And so the past survives not in ruins or artifacts, but in the souls of the people who carry it. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, the lost civilization leaves its mark on the future. In myths, in symbols, in structures, in memories, in the quiet, unbroken flow of time, and if enough fragments remain. If we open our eyes and hearts to the possibility, the story of that civilization begins to take shape again gently, slowly, like a forgotten dream rising to the surface of the night. Now imagine leaving the plains behind and traveling toward the high mountains, regions that have always been sanctuaries for memory. Even today, remote mountain valleys hold stories older than the civilizations that surround them. In the days after the Great Flood and the long age of wandering, these valleys became places where fragments of the oldest knowledge survived, guarded by small groups who passed their stories from mouth to ear, from heart to heart, without ever writing them down. If a civilization existed 200,000 years before Sumer, then its last breaths may have been exhaled in these mountains, far from the rising waters that consume the world below, in the Himalayas, in the Caucasus, in the mountains of East Africa. Ancient tribes preserve tales of the first people, the ancient ones, the ones who came before the flood. Their stories describe advanced beings, not gods. Not spirits, but ancestors who built structures the survivors no longer understood. Structures of stone, structures of light, structures aligned with the heavens. Some tribes even speak of a time when the sky looked different, when certain stars stood in positions they no longer do, when seasons lasted longer, when the world felt warmer. These details match astronomical cycles that take tens of thousands of years to change. Cycles no early human should have known about, unless someone before them witnessed those changes and passed the memory forward. Imagine a tribe gathered around a fire high in the mountains, the wind howling outside their stone shelters. The elders speak of the time before the flood of great ones, who understood the sky and built homes that touched the clouds. They describe a world where knowledge flowed freely, where people lived in harmony with the land, where the rivers carried messages and the stones sang in certain frequencies. And though the children hear these stories as myths, the truth behind them is older than the mountains themselves. Further west, in the Atlas Mountains, legends speak of a great kingdom that existed before the sea swallowed the coast, a land ruled by wise people who possessed knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and sound. The Berbers have preserved this story for generations, unaware that modern scholars struggle to explain ruins scattered across North Africa, ruins that seem far older than expected. Some stones bear markings that resemble star maps. Others align with solstice points. These traces, faint and fragmented, hint at a forgotten age. And then, in the jungles of Africa, there are tribes whose myths describe beings who walked with the stars, who remembered the sky before it shifted, and who built the first houses of stone. These myths are not isolated. They appear across continents, stories of an age erased, yet somehow remembered everywhere. Now imagine moving north to Europe. Long before the rise of Greece or Rome, picture early humans carving symbols into caves, spirals, circles, patterns that match lunar cycles and the movements of stars. Some of these carvings are over 30,000 years old. But what if the knowledge behind them is even older? What if these cave painters were not inventing art, but preserving the echoes of something taught to them by ancestors who survived the collapse of a civilization so old that even they did not fully understand it? As the night wraps itself more deeply around you, imagine following a narrow path into a European cave. The air is cold and still. You light a torch, and shadows dance along the walls. In the flickering light, you see animals carved with incredible precision: bison, horses, lions. But look closer. Behind the animals are patterns of dots and lines. Many match astronomical configurations, constellations, lunar phases, star positions. These patterns were not guessed. They were known. They were recorded with intention. But how could early humans have known these things unless someone before them had spent thousands of years observing the sky? Now picture yourself far to the west, on a coastline that would one day become the British Isles. The wind carries the scent of salt and cold. But in your mind, you see stone circles, rising circles older than Stonehenge, circles we have not yet discovered. Some align with the solstices, others with stars, others with invisible lines of the Earth's magnetic field. These structures were not the work of simple hunters. They were the remnants of a memory of a time when civilization understood the sky far better than we do now. And across the ocean, in the Americas, imagine ancient tribes watching the stars. The Maya built structures aligned with Venus cycles that take thousands of years to measure. The Hopi speak of ages before the present one, ages of destruction and rebirth. The Incas carved symbols into stone that reflect astronomical cycles known only to complex societies. All of these traces scattered across the world speak of knowledge too old, too deep, too consistent to be coincidence. As civilizations rose and fell, as time flowed like a river carrying everything with it, the fragments of the lost civilization were never fully erased. They hid in the stories of tribes, in the symbols carved into stone, in the alignments of ancient structures, in the memories passed through generations. And tonight, in this quiet moment as you listen, these fragments begin to come together, forming a shape in the darkness. Shape of a world that once existed 200,000 years before Sumer. A world humanity forgot. A world that may have been the true beginning. A world whose last echo still whispers beneath our feet. Imagine now descending from the mountains into a wide valley as dawn slowly breaks over a landscape that has not existed for thousands upon thousands of years. The air is still, the earth quiet, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Mist rises from the grass, carrying the faint scent of moisture and soil. And the early light reveals shapestones arranged with intention. Paths that seem too straight to be natural. Shadows of structures long collapsed, but not completely erased. In this silence, something ancient stirs. A presence, a memory, a faint echo of hands that once shaped these stones with purpose. This was not Sumer. This was not Egypt. This was a world much older, so old that its ruins have become part of the earth itself. Picture the people who lived here. Not primitive, not simplistic, but survivors of something immense, survivors who carried fragments of a memory they barely understood. Their ancestors had known more than they could now recall, advanced knowledge of the stars, of sound, of stone, of cycles of time. But so much had been lost in the great catastrophe that wiped their world clean. All they had left were shadows of knowledge, fragments of a once great civilization passed down like fading dreams. Yet even these fragments were powerful. Imagine these people gathering round a central fire, not just to stay warm, but to remember. They speak softly, telling stories of the world before the world their ancestors once described. A world where structures of unimaginable size stood beneath skies, filled with constellations that looked different from the ones above them now. A world where rivers flowed through cities that no longer exist. A world where the cycle of the heavens was understood so deeply that people could predict celestial events thousands of years in advance. These stories do not feel like fantasy. They feel like memory, dim, uncertain, seen as if through clouds, but memory nonetheless. And as generations pass, some of these memories begin to take form again. Imagine a group of people deciding to mark the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, not because they know why, but because their ancestors once did. They gather stones, align them with the position of the sunrise on the shortest day. They build a circle, simple at first, but meaningful. And when the sun rises exactly where they expected, something awakens inside them, feeling a recognition, a whisper of the old world. Over time, these circles grow more complex. They begin to mark more celestial events. They evolve into the megalithic structures we find scattered across the earth today. To modern eyes, they appear primitive. To those who built them, they were a way to remember something far older. Now imagine a different part of the world, a dense jungle in what is now Southeast Asia. It is humid, live with sound. Beneath the thick canopy lies a mystery: artificial mounds, stone platforms, and what appears to be the foundation of an ancient city, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The roots of trees wrap around the stones like skeletal hands, trying to hide them. Modern explorers believe these ruins may be tens of thousands of years older than Sumer, older than Egypt. But what if they are far older still? What if this was one of the last outposts of the lost civilization, preserved only because the jungle swallowed it whole before the rising seas could reach it? And then there are the legend stories scattered across Asia of first kingdoms that existed before the known world began. Stories of beings who could harness sound, energy, and the power of the earth. Stories of temples that vibrated with frequencies that healed or harmed. Stories of ancient roads that once stretched across continents, now buried beneath layers of sediment. Stories too old to trace, too consistent to ignore. As you listen, picture these ancient people not as scientists or engineers in the modern sense, but as individuals deeply connected to the natural rhythms of the earth. They understood resonance. They understood stone. They understood sound. They understood the cycles of the heavens. They lived in harmony with their environment. For tens of thousands of years' time, enough for knowledge to deepen and evolve in ways we can barely comprehend. Now imagine an even older memory of something that came before even them. Some tribes speak of the first ones, beings who walked the earth long before the flood, long before the ice, long before the world changed again and again. They are described not as gods, but as humans with knowledge of the stars, the earth, and the spirit. Humans who built structures in places we have not yet rediscovered. Humans who disappeared when the world was young, leaving behind only scattered hints of their existence. Could these first ones have been the people of the lost civilization? If so, Their world would have existed in a time beyond imagining 200,000 years before the earliest cities we recognize. Far enough back that their buildings would now be dust. Far enough back that their cities would lie beneath oceans. Far enough back that only the strongest stone carved in the deepest places could have survived. And far enough back that their story would feel like a dream humanity forgot, but never fully erased. Tonight, as your mind drifts deeper into this forgotten world, imagine that dream rising again, piece by piece, revealing the faint outline of a civilization older than Sumer, older than Egypt, older than every myth, every ruin, every monument we have ever found. A civilization that once lived, once thrived, and then vanished, leaving behind only whispers in the dark. Imagine now traveling across the ancient world as it lay long before maps, long before borders, long before nations were ever imagined. The earth was vast, untamed, and alive in ways lost to the modern age. Volcanic mountains rose like sleeping giants, their slopes covered in forests so ancient that the oldest trees of today would seem like children beside them. Rivers stretched for thousands of miles, carving pathways through continents we no longer recognize. Animals wandered freely across lands not yet divided by human hands. And in this immense, ancient world, the traces of the lost civilization still slept, scattered like faint stars across the landscape, waiting for someone with patience and wonder to see them for what they were. Picture yourself walking through a desert, not the desert we know today, but an older one, a younger one, a desert that was once a thriving plain filled with lakes and grasslands. The Sahara itself was once green, dotted with rivers, forests, and settlements. It is almost impossible to imagine now, staring at its endless dunes of gold and fire. But beneath those mountains of sand lie the possible remains of a world that existed tens of thousands of years before. Sumer, ancient riverbeds have been detected beneath the desert. Strange structures, lines to straight, shapes to perfect appear on satellite scans, as if the sand is hiding the blueprint of a forgotten city. Could this have been part of the lost civilization? A city swallowed by sand long before history began. Imagine standing on one of those dunes as the wind moves across it, shifting the sand like waves. For a moment, as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, the shapes of ancient foundations appear beneath your feet walls. Corridors, perhaps even monuments now smoothed by time. You kneel down, running your fingers through the sand, feeling grains that have covered secrets for tens of thousands of years. And you wonder, how many times has the earth buried its own story? How many civilizations rose and fell without leaving anything behind but whispers lost in the wind? Now imagine moving from the desert toward the jungles of South America. The canopy above you is thick, alive with the hum of insects and distant calls of unknown creatures. Beneath this living roof of green lies one of the greatest mysteries on Earth, structures so ancient that trees have grown through them, roots wrapping around stones as if trying to pull them back into the earth. Some of these structures are aligned with astronomical events that would take millennia to observe. Some use mathematical ratios far more advanced than expected for their time. Some appear so perfect, so precise, that the builders must have had knowledge that our civilizations rediscovered only recently. But the jungle hides more than it reveals. It swallows cities, covers pathways, buries temples under layers of soil and vegetation. The people who built these structures are long gone, their names forgotten. Yet the stones remain immovable, resisting time itself. And in those stones lie the silent echoes of a world that existed not just thousands, but perhaps tens of thousands of years before any recorded civilization. Maybe older still. Maybe old enough to be connected to that forgotten world 200,000 years before. Imagine the builders' people who understood the sky so deeply that they could predict eclipses, solstices, and celestial cycles with precision that astonishes modern astronomers. People who carved stones weighing dozens of tons and moved them across miles of dense jungle without the wheel, without metal, without anything we could identify. People whose mathematical and architectural knowledge appears out of nowhere in the archaeological record sudden, complete, sophisticated. But knowledge does not appear suddenly. Knowledge grows. Knowledge evolves. Knowledge is inherited. So if these civilizations appeared with advanced understanding already in their hands, who gave it to them? Or what did they remember? Now picture yourself moving north toward the frozen lands of Siberia. The air grows colder, sharper, as the landscape stretches into vast plains of snow and ice. Here, beneath layers of permafrost, ancient bone tools, carvings, and artifacts have been found, some so old they challenge everything we know about human history. Some show signs of craftsmanship far more advanced than expected. Some contain symbols that do not match any known culture. These are fragments, yes, but they hint at something profound, a memory older than recorded time, preserved in the cold because the earth itself refused to let it rot away. Further west, in Europe, you find ancient stone circles hidden in the hills, not Stonehenge older structures. Smaller, more modest, but aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. Some date back far earlier than expected. Some scientists hesitate to announce their true age, because doing so would force a rewrite of the entire history of human development. For if these structures are as old as they appear, then the people who built them possessed knowledge far beyond what early humans should have known. Knowledge inherited from where? Imagine now traveling to the Pacific, where legends speak of Mu, of Lemuria, of a land swallowed by the sea long before memory began. These legends exist across many islands, separated by thousands of miles. How could so many cultures share the same story unless it was based on something real? Something remembered from a time long before the Pacific swallowed entire continents beneath its waves. And now, in the quiet of this night, imagine all these fragments scattered across deserts, jungles, mountains, oceans coming together, not as isolated enigmas, but as pieces of one vast, ancient puzzle. A puzzle pointing toward a single truth. Humanity has lived many ages. Not just one, not just two, but cycles upon cycles, rising, falling, rising again. And somewhere in those ancient cycles lived a civilization older than we dare imagine. A civilization older than Sumer. A civilization older than written history. A civilization that may have walked the earth 200,000 years before the world we know began. Their story is not lost. It is simply hidden, waiting, calling, whispering in the stones, in the myths, in the stars. Now imagine the world entering one of its long, quiet cycles of time between disasters, between upheavals, between the great resets that shaped the planet over tens of thousands of years. The earth breathes slowly during these cycles. The seas settle. The climate softens. Life regrows in places once destroyed. Forests spread across continents. Rivers carve new paths through fresh soil. And humanity, the scattered survivors of a world erased, begins once again to gather, to build, to remember. But what they remember is not complete. It is not whole. It is not the civilization that once existed 200,000 years before Sumer. It is only the faintest echo of it. A feeling in the bones, a whisper in dreams, an instinctive pull toward the stars and the stones, an inner knowing that humans are older than their history suggests. They do not recall the details of the old world, the language, the cities, the knowledge of resonance or celestial cycles, but they remember just enough to rebuild the foundations of what would later become civilization. Imagine early humans gathering stones, not because they fully understand what their ancestors knew, but because they feel the need to mark something sacred. They align stones with the sunrise because deep inside, something tells them that the sun matters not just for warmth and light, but for reasons they can no longer explain. They carve spirals and circles because these shapes echo in their minds from a time long forgotten. They build mounds, hill forts, earthworks, stone markers, all without knowing that they are repeating patterns from a world that once flourished in a distant age. And slowly, the knowledge begins to return. Imagine a time thousands of years later, long after the flood, long after the survivors rebuilt their scattered communities, when a new generation begins to look at the stars with curiosity. They notice that certain stars rise at specific times of the year. They track the movement of the moon, the shifting seasons, the cycles of growth and decay. They observe, they learn, they pass these observations forward. To them, it feels like discovery. But in truth, it is remembrance. Remembrance of knowledge that once belonged to a civilization that lived 200,000 years before. Now imagine the Earth beginning to change again. Climate shifts, ice advances. The world cools. Great beasts roam the land, and humans adapt, moving across continents, seeking warmth and safety. In this time of trial, myths become the glue that holds communities together. Elders tell stories of the Great Flood, of the time before time, of the ancestors who walked with the stars. These stories are more than entertainment. They are maps. Maps of memory, maps of survival, maps of knowledge that must not be forgotten. And through these stories, the last whispers of the lost civilization endure. Picture one tribe gathered near a fire, listening to an elder speak softly in the darkness. The flames reflect in his eyes as he tells of a city that once existed near a great inland sea, now vanished. A city of shining stones, of towers that touched the sky, of stars reflected in water, so calm it looked like glass. He tells of a people who understood the earth's heartbeat, who built their world with harmony and precision, who lived through ages unimaginable to the tribe listening. He tells them that these people were their ancestors, not gods, not spirits, but humans, just like them. Humans who lived long before the flood. The children listen with awe. The adults listen with silence. None of them realize that parts of this story may be true, passed down through countless generations, distorted by time, softened by memory, but rooted in a world that once existed far beyond the reach of archaeology. And when these stories are eventually carried to new lands, preserved by different cultures, transformed into myths of gods, giants, and golden ages, the truth becomes harder to see, but it is still there, hidden beneath layers of symbolism. Imagine these stories traveling across continents, becoming the Sumerian accounts of kings who ruled for thousands of years, becoming the Egyptian tales of Zep-Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth, becoming the Greek myths of titans and lost ages, becoming the Indian stories of cycles of creation and destruction, becoming the South American legends of Viracocha and the Ancient Ones, becoming the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories of worlds before this one, becoming echoes, reflections, fragments of a memory long older than recorded history. Now imagine that by the time Sumer finally rose around 6,000 years ago, was not humanity's first civilization. It was merely the first to arise after the last great silence, the first to rediscover writing, the first to rebuild large cities, the first to record their version of the stories of the past. And they wrote of a time when civilization descended from the heavens. It's not because gods literally came down, but because ancient knowledge returned to them from the memories of those who survived. As you sit in the quiet darkness of this night, let this thought settle gently. What we call the beginning of civilization may simply be the beginning of the last chapter. Before Sumer, there may have been many civilizations, and before them, perhaps even more. Cycles rising, cycles falling, each leaving behind faint traces for the next to find. Time washing the world clean, again and again, but never fully erasing everything. And somewhere in those deep cycles, somewhere in the vast expanse of hundreds, of thousands of years. A civilization may have flourished, a civilization we are only beginning to rediscover through fragments, myths, and whispers carried by time. Imagine now that the night is at its deepest still, quiet, gentle in a way that makes the world feel ancient again. The air around you seems to thicken with memory, as if the darkness itself carries voices from ages long forgotten. And in this silence, in this soft, slow breath of the universe, the story of the lost civilization begins to reach its final echo. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a great cliff. Below you, a vast plain stretches into the distance, a plain that no longer exists in the world you know. You see ghost-like outlines of rivers, long dried, mountains, long eroded, coastlines long swallowed by the sea. But in your mind, the plain is alive again. You see lights, fire pits, stone circles, settlements glowing beneath a night sky untouched by pollution. You see early humans gathered, not as nomads wandering without purpose, but as a society with intention, memory, structure. You see the first sparks of civilization flicker in their ascent, inheritance of a world far older than the one they now inhabit. You close your eyes, and the wind brings forth a whisper, a voice that does not belong to a single person or a single age. It feels like the voice of humanity itself. It tells you that civilizations rise and fall, not once, but many times. It tells you that time is not a straight line, but a cycle-on, endless rhythm of creation and destruction, learning and forgetting, remembering and rebuilding. It tells you that the world we know today is only the latest chapter in a book whose earliest pages are long lost, and yet not entirely lost. Fragments survive, a stone aligned with the solstice, a carving that maps the stars, a myth that mirrors a geological event, a tool buried in layers older than human history, a genetic marker hinting at migrations long before we imagined, a submerged ruin that should not exist, a story told by elders who do not know how old their story really is. These fragments are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of a civilization erased by time, but not by truth. They are the last embers of a world that lived 200,000 years before Sumer, a world that flourished, fell, and left behind only whispers in the dark. Imagine now standing not in the past, but in the present. You look at ancient structures, pyramids, stone circles, temples, and you feel a sense of déjà vu, as if humanity is remembering something it has long forgotten. Every generation uncovers new clues, new anomalies, new questions that push the timeline of human civilization further back. Archaeologists find older tools, older bones, older symbols, older structures. Every discovery challenges the story we once believed to be complete. It becomes clear, slowly, quietly, like a dawn rising over forgotten mountains. Humanity is older than we think. Civilization is older than we think. Knowledge is older than we think. What if the people of the lost civilization did not disappear entirely? What if their blood flows in ours? What if their memories live in our DNA, their stories in our myths, their knowledge in the instincts that guide us still? What if every human alive today carries a spark from that ancient world, a spark waiting to be understood? As the night story nears its end, imagine yourself walking away from the ancient cliff, leaving behind the forgotten plain. But something stays with you, a feeling, a presence, a quiet truth. You realize that history is not just what is written in books. History is everything the earth remembers, everything the stones remember, everything the stars remember, and everything humanity carries silently within itself. Tonight, in this calm darkness, you have walked through a world that may have existed 200,000 years before Sumer. You have followed its echoes through deserts, mountains, jungles, oceans. You have listened to its fragments in myths, symbols, ruins, and memories. You have seen how its story might have flowed into every civilization that came after Egypt, Sumer, India, China, the Americas, the Pacific. You have felt how its last. Breath still lingers in the human soul, and as the final moments of this nighttime journey settle over you like a soft blanket, one thought rises gently, slowly, like the first light of dawn. Maybe humanity has forgotten its first story. But the earth has not. The stars have not. And deep inside, neither have we. This has been a quiet journey into the oldest chapter of human existence. A chapter buried by time, but not erased. A chapter waiting to be rediscovered. And until we uncover it fully, it will continue to whisper in our myths, in our ruins. In our dreams, welcome to Dreams of History. And thank you for remembering with me tonight.